Question 1. Risk assessment procedures indicate that Ferguson Enterprises is facing increased exposure to cybersecurity threats due to its expanding digital footprint. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a robust and compliant risk management framework for addressing this evolving threat landscape? Option A. Focus on reducing the IT budget for cybersecurity measures to free up capital for other business initiatives, assuming current defenses are adequate. Option B. Immediately implement a broad range of new security software and hardware solutions across all departments to proactively counter all potential threats. Option C. Conduct a thorough analysis of potential cybersecurity risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and then prioritize mitigation strategies in line with Ferguson Enterprises' established risk tolerance and regulatory obligations. Option D. Rely on the IT department's informal knowledge of past security incidents to guide the selection and implementation of new security protocols. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement a broad range of new security software and hardware solutions across all departments to proactively counter all potential threats. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Ferguson Enterprises' internal risk appetite and the external regulatory environment to ensure compliance and protect the company. The pressure to quickly implement new controls, coupled with the potential for significant financial and reputational damage, necessitates a structured and informed approach to risk assessment. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of potential risks, considering their likelihood and impact, and then prioritizing mitigation strategies based on Ferguson Enterprises' defined risk tolerance. This aligns with general principles of good corporate governance and risk management, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory bodies to ensure the stability and integrity of financial operations. Specifically, it emphasizes a proactive and data-driven methodology to identify and address vulnerabilities before they materialize into actual losses or compliance breaches. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without a thorough risk analysis fails to adequately identify and address potential threats. This could lead to the implementation of insufficient controls, leaving Ferguson Enterprises exposed to significant regulatory penalties, operational disruptions, or reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over accuracy in identifying risks overlooking critical vulnerabilities. This haste can result in a false sense of security, where significant risks are either underestimated or entirely missed, leading to potential compliance failures and financial losses. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without a formal, documented risk assessment process is also problematic. This subjective method lacks the rigor required for effective risk management and can lead to biased decision-making, potentially ignoring emerging threats or misjudging the severity of existing ones. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding Ferguson Enterprises' strategic objectives and risk appetite. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk identification process, assessing the likelihood and impact of each identified risk, and then developing and prioritizing mitigation strategies. Regular review and adaptation of the risk assessment process are crucial to ensure its continued effectiveness in a dynamic environment. Question 2. The performance metrics show a significant decline in client satisfaction scores for a key service offered by Ferguson Enterprises over the past quarter. While the sales team is pushing to report these figures, as is to meet their quarterly targets, the operations department suggests that the decline is due to temporary system glitches that have since been resolved. What is the most appropriate course of action for a compliance officer at Ferguson Enterprises to take in this situation? Option A. Recommend that Ferguson Enterprises focus its reporting on other positive performance indicators for the quarter and downplay the client satisfaction decline. Option B. Conduct an independent investigation into the client satisfaction decline, verifying the claims of both the sales and operations departments, and then report the findings accurately, recommending corrective actions based on the investigation's outcome. Option C. Advise the sales team to adjust the reporting of client satisfaction scores to reflect a more positive trend, given that the system glitches have been resolved. Option D. Immediately report the decline in client satisfaction scores as presented by the sales team to ensure transparency with stakeholders, even if the operations department believes the issue is resolved. The correct answer is B. Conduct an independent investigation into the client's satisfaction decline, verifying the claims of both the sales and operations departments, and then report the findings accurately, recommending corrective actions based on the investigation's outcome. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Ferguson Enterprises to interpret performance data in the context of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, rather than solely focusing on immediate financial outcomes. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to overlook or misrepresent information, making careful judgment and adherence to established frameworks crucial. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the performance metrics, cross-referencing them with Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to identify any discrepancies or potential misrepresentations. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and compliance. By seeking to understand the root cause of any underperformance and addressing it through appropriate channels, the individual upholds their ethical duty to Ferguson Enterprises and adheres to the principles of responsible business conduct expected under the applicable regulatory framework. This proactive and investigative stance ensures that any issues are identified and rectified before they escalate into significant compliance breaches or reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on manipulating the reporting to show positive results without investigating the underlying performance issues fails to uphold the duty of care and honesty. This could lead to violations of regulations requiring accurate financial reporting and disclosure. Another incorrect approach, which involves ignoring the metrics altogether due to their negative nature, demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to address potential problems within Ferguson Enterprises. This inaction can be interpreted as a dereliction of duty and may also contravene regulatory expectations for oversight and accountability. Finally, an approach that involves blaming external factors without a thorough internal investigation also falls short. While external factors can influence performance, a responsible professional must first conduct a comprehensive internal review to determine the extent of internal responsibility and identify areas for improvement before attributing issues solely to external causes. This failure to conduct a proper internal assessment can lead to continued underperformance and potential regulatory scrutiny for lack of effective management. Professionals at Ferguson Enterprises should employ a decision-making process that begins with a commitment to integrity and compliance. When faced with performance data, the first step is always to verify its accuracy and understand its implications. This involves comparing the data against established benchmarks, internal policies, and regulatory requirements. If discrepancies or concerning trends emerge, the next step is to investigate the root causes through a systematic and objective process. This investigation should involve gathering all relevant information, consulting with appropriate stakeholders, and documenting findings. Based on the investigation, a plan of action should be developed that addresses the identified issues in a compliant and ethical manner. This plan should be communicated transparently to relevant parties within Ferguson Enterprises and, if necessary, to regulatory bodies. Question 3. Quality control measures reveal that Ferguson Enterprises is preparing to issue a press release highlighting strong projected revenue growth for the upcoming fiscal year. However, internal analysis indicates significant potential headwinds due to emerging competitive pressures and anticipated supply chain disruptions that could materially impact these projections. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical best practices for Ferguson Enterprises? Option A. Delay the press release until all potential risks are fully resolved, even if it means missing a key communication window. Option B. Issue the press release with the strong projected revenue growth and supplement it with specific, detailed disclosures about the identified competitive pressures and supply chain risks. Option C. Issue the press release with the strong projected revenue growth, but include a general disclaimer about market uncertainties. Option D. Issue the press release focusing solely on historical performance data, omitting any forward-looking revenue projections. The correct answer is C. Issue the press release with the strong projected revenue growth, but include a general disclaimer about market uncertainties. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises due to the potential for misrepresenting the financial health of the company to investors. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to present a positive outlook with the absolute requirement for accurate and transparent financial reporting. Failure to do so can lead to severe regulatory penalties, loss of investor confidence, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any forward-looking statements are grounded in reality and comply with all applicable regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves ensuring that all forward-looking statements made by Ferguson Enterprises are accompanied by clear, specific, and material risk disclosures. This aligns with the principles of transparency and investor protection mandated by regulatory frameworks designed to prevent misleading information. Such disclosures allow investors to make informed decisions by understanding the potential downsides and uncertainties associated with the projected performance. This approach upholds ethical standards by prioritizing truthfulness and preventing undue optimism from masking genuine risks. Incorrect approach is analysis. Presenting optimistic projections without any mention of potential risks or challenges is ethically unsound and violates regulatory requirements for full and fair disclosure. This approach misleads investors by creating an incomplete picture of the company's prospects, potentially leading to investment decisions based on flawed information. Focusing solely on historical performance data to justify future projections, while ignoring current market shifts or internal operational challenges, can also be misleading. Regulatory bodies expect companies to consider all material factors, both positive and negative, when making forward-looking statements. This approach fails to acknowledge evolving circumstances that could impact future results, making vague or generic statements about potential risks, such as market volatility, without providing specific details relevant to Ferguson Enterprises' business, is insufficient. Regulators require disclosures that are specific enough to be meaningful to investors, allowing them to assess the actual impact of identified risks on the company's operations and financial performance. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Ferguson Enterprises should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and compliance. This involves a thorough assessment of all relevant information, including internal operational data, market conditions, and potential external factors. When making forward-looking statements, a robust risk assessment process should be undertaken, and all material risks should be clearly and specifically disclosed. This proactive approach ensures that investors receive a balanced view, fostering trust and long-term relationships. Question 4. The efficiency study reveals a significant and unexplained deviation in the performance metrics for a key operational process at Ferguson Enterprises. While the target was to achieve a 15% improvement, the preliminary data suggests only a 5% improvement, yet the system is reporting the target has been met. Option A. Manually adjust the reported figures in the system to reflect the targeted 15% improvement, assuming the system has a minor glitch. Option B. Discuss the discrepancy with a trusted colleague to gauge their opinion before deciding on a course of action. Option C. Immediately report the discrepancy to your direct supervisor and the internal audit department, providing all relevant data and observations. Option D. Overlook the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor reporting error that will likely be corrected later by the IT department. The correct answer is C. Immediately report the discrepancy to your direct supervisor and the internal audit department, providing all relevant data and observations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises employees due to the potential conflict between achieving efficiency targets and maintaining ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet performance metrics can tempt individuals to overlook or rationalize actions that might be questionable, requiring careful judgment to prioritize integrity over short-term gains. The correct approach involves immediately reporting the observed discrepancy to the appropriate internal channels, such as a supervisor or compliance department, without attempting to rectify the situation independently or ignore it. This upholds the principles of transparency and accountability central to Ferguson Enterprises' ethical framework and regulatory obligations. Specifically, this aligns with the implied duty of employees to act in the best interest of the company and to report any suspected misconduct or noncompliance, as would be expected under standard corporate governance and any applicable industry regulations that mandate reporting mechanisms for ethical breaches. An incorrect approach would be to attempt to manually adjust the data to match the expected outcome. This action constitutes data manipulation, which is a serious ethical breach and potentially illegal, undermining the integrity of the efficiency study and any subsequent decisions based on it. It violates the principle of honesty and could lead to misallocation of resources or incorrect strategic planning, causing harm to Ferguson Enterprises. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor error or not significant enough to warrant attention. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and responsibility. By failing to report, the employee allows a potential issue to persist, which could have larger, unforeseen consequences for Ferguson Enterprises and may violate a duty to act with reasonable care and skill. This inaction could also be seen as complicity if the discrepancy is later found to be intentional. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to discuss the discrepancy with colleagues outside of the formal reporting structure before reporting it. This could lead to the spread of misinformation, create unnecessary anxiety, or even be construed as an attempt to collude or cover up the issue. It bypasses established protocols for addressing such matters, which are designed to ensure a fair and thorough investigation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves understanding company policies on reporting, identifying potential conflicts of interest, and acting with integrity. When faced with a discrepancy, the first step should always be to consult internal reporting procedures and escalate the matter through the designated channels, ensuring that all actions are documented and transparent. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that Ferguson Enterprises investment analysts often gain access to material non-public information regarding their clients' upcoming merger and acquisition activities. An analyst at Ferguson Enterprises, aware of an impending, unannounced acquisition by a major client that is expected to significantly boost the target company's stock price, is considering purchasing shares in the target company before the public announcement. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible and legally compliant course of action for the Ferguson Enterprises analyst? Option A. Purchase shares in the target company, but only after a significant portion of the anticipated price increase has already occurred, to minimize perceived risk. Option B. Discuss the potential acquisition with a trusted friend outside of Ferguson Enterprises, who is also an investor, to gauge their opinion on the market impact. Option C. Refrain from trading in the target company's shares and immediately report the potential conflict of interest and the nature of the information to Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department. Option D. Immediately purchase shares in the target company, as the information is not yet public and represents a clear opportunity for profit. The correct answer is D. Immediately purchase shares in the target company, as the information is not yet public and represents a clear opportunity for profit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to maintain market integrity. Employees are privy to sensitive, non-public information about Ferguson's clients' strategic decisions, which could significantly impact market prices if disclosed. The challenge lies in balancing the duty of loyalty to Ferguson and its clients with the legal and ethical obligations to prevent market abuse. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any actions taken by employees do not inadvertently or intentionally lead to insider trading or other forms of market manipulation. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies on information handling and compliance with relevant securities regulations. This means employees must refrain from trading on any client-specific information they possess, even if it appears to be advantageous. They must also report any potential conflicts of interest or breaches of confidentiality to the compliance department immediately. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the principles of insider trading prevention, which are foundational to maintaining fair and orderly financial markets. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing securities trading, explicitly prohibit the use of material non-public information for personal gain or to influence market activity. By prioritizing confidentiality and compliance, Ferguson Enterprises upholds its ethical obligations and avoids legal repercussions. An incorrect approach would be to trade on the information, believing it offers a guaranteed profit. This is a direct violation of insider trading laws and ethical codes. Such an action exploits privileged information, undermines market fairness, and erodes investor confidence. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the information with external parties, even if not for direct trading purposes, as this still constitutes a breach of confidentiality and can indirectly lead to market abuse if those parties act on the information. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the information and take no action, hoping it goes unnoticed. This passive stance fails to proactively address a potential compliance issue and could still result in liability if the information is later revealed to have been used improperly. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves a clear understanding of company policies and relevant laws, a commitment to confidentiality, and a proactive approach to identifying and mitigating potential conflicts of interest. When faced with information that could be considered material and non-public, the default action should always be to err on the side of caution, refrain from any action that could be construed as trading or disclosure, and seek guidance from the compliance department. Question 6. Governance review demonstrates that Ferguson Enterprises has identified potential risks associated with its new client onboarding process. Which of the following approaches to assessing and mitigating these risks best aligns with the regulatory framework and guidelines for the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test jurisdiction? Option A. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that maps identified onboarding risks directly to specific clauses within the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test jurisdiction's financial services regulations and associated guidance. Option B. Adopting industry best practices for client onboarding risk management, assuming these will inherently satisfy regulatory requirements. Option C. Applying a risk assessment methodology commonly used in a different, unspecified jurisdiction, as it has proven effective elsewhere. Option D. Focusing on mitigating risks that have the most significant potential impact on Ferguson Enterprises' profitability, irrespective of specific regulatory mandates. Correct answer is A. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that maps identified onboarding risks directly to specific clauses within the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test jurisdiction's financial services regulations and associated guidance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Ferguson Enterprises, as a financial services firm, operates within a highly regulated environment. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient risk management with the absolute requirement to adhere to the specific regulatory framework governing its operations. A superficial or generalized approach to risk assessment could lead to non-compliance, potentially resulting in significant penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Careful judgment is required to identify and apply the precise regulatory requirements relevant to the identified risks. The correct approach involves a detailed examination of the Ferguson Enterprises internal control framework and its alignment with the specific regulatory requirements of the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test jurisdiction. This means identifying which specific regulations, guidelines, or legal statutes are applicable to the identified risks, and ensuring that the company's risk assessment processes directly address these. The regulatory justification for this approach is rooted in the principle of compliance, which mandates that all business activities, including hiring and risk management, must strictly adhere to the established legal and regulatory framework. Failure to do so can result in enforcement actions, fines, and other sanctions. An incorrect approach that relies on generic risk assessment principles without specific regulatory grounding fails to meet the compliance obligations. This is a regulatory failure because it overlooks the detailed mandates and prohibitions set forth by the governing bodies. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on operational efficiency without considering the regulatory implications is also a failure. This is an ethical failure because it prioritizes internal goals over the duty to protect clients and the integrity of the financial system, as mandated by regulations. A third incorrect approach that attempts to apply principles from a different, unspecified jurisdiction would be a critical jurisdictional failure, leading to non-compliance with the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test jurisdiction's specific rules. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory landscape. When a governance review identifies potential risks, the immediate next step is to cross-reference these risks with the specific requirements of the relevant regulatory framework. This involves consulting official regulatory documents, seeking legal counsel if necessary, and ensuring that the risk assessment methodology is designed to capture and address these specific obligations. The focus should always be on demonstrable compliance with the letter and spirit of the law and ethical guidelines. Question 7. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual trading activity within Ferguson Enterprises' proprietary trading desk that deviates from historical norms. This deviation has been flagged by the system as potentially indicative of a compliance breach. Option A. Classify the flagged trading activity as a low-priority alert and monitor it for a further period to see if the pattern resolves itself naturally. Option B. Initiate a detailed review of the flagged trading activity, cross-referencing it with Ferguson Enterprises' internal trading policies, market abuse regulations, and historical data to determine the nature and severity of the deviation before taking further action. Option C. Immediately escalate the flagged trading activity to the Chief Compliance Officer and the Head of Trading for urgent discussion and decision-making, without conducting an initial internal assessment. Option D. Implement an immediate, firm-wide trading halt based on the system alert, pending a full investigation, without first assessing the specific nature of the flagged activity. The correct answer is B. Initiate a detailed review of the flagged trading activity, cross-referencing it with Ferguson Enterprises' internal trading policies, market abuse regulations, and historical data to determine the nature and severity of the deviation before taking further action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Ferguson Enterprises, as a regulated entity, must ensure its internal monitoring systems not only detect potential breaches, but also trigger appropriate and timely responses. The challenge lies in balancing the need for immediate action with the requirement to follow established procedures and regulatory mandates. Misinterpreting or mishandling the information from the monitoring system can lead to regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and harm to stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to assess the severity of the detected anomaly and determine the most effective and compliant course of action. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the detected anomaly against Ferguson Enterprises' established compliance policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. This approach is correct because it prioritizes a systematic and documented process. By cross-referencing the monitoring system's output with internal procedures and external regulations, Ferguson Enterprises can ensure that any subsequent actions are both proportionate to the detected issue and legally sound. This methodical review minimizes the risk of overreaction or underreaction, both of which can have negative consequences. It also provides a clear audit trail, essential for demonstrating compliance to regulators. An incorrect approach that involves immediately escalating the anomaly to senior management without initial internal assessment fails to adhere to established procedural controls. This bypasses the necessary steps for verifying the anomaly's significance and potential impact, potentially causing undue alarm and diverting senior resources unnecessarily. It also risks inconsistent application of compliance protocols. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the anomaly if it appears minor, is a direct violation of regulatory expectations for proactive monitoring and risk management. Regulators expect firms to investigate all detected anomalies, regardless of perceived initial severity, as minor issues can escalate or indicate systemic weaknesses. This approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the firm's compliance obligations. A further incorrect approach, which is to implement a corrective action based solely on the monitoring system's alert without further investigation or policy review, risks applying an inappropriate or ineffective solution. The monitoring system may flag an issue, but the root cause and the most suitable remediation strategy require a deeper understanding that goes beyond the alert itself. This can lead to wasted resources and a failure to address the actual problem, potentially leaving Ferguson Enterprises exposed to ongoing risks and regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's compliance framework, including its monitoring procedures, escalation protocols, and relevant regulatory obligations. When an anomaly is detected, the first step should be to verify and assess its nature and potential impact through a structured review process. This assessment should then inform the decision on the appropriate response, which may involve further investigation, consultation with relevant departments, implementation of corrective actions, or escalation to senior management or regulators, all documented meticulously. Question 8. Process analysis reveals that Ferguson Enterprises' current candidate onboarding workflow for the hiring assessment test is experiencing delays. A proposed optimization involves automating the initial screening of candidate responses to identify common errors, with the aim of expediting feedback and reducing manual review time. However, this automation is being developed internally without explicit consultation with the guidelines governing the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible approach for Ferguson Enterprises to take regarding this proposed process optimization? Option A. Implement the automated screening tool immediately to address the identified delays, with a plan to review its compliance with Ferguson Enterprises' hiring assessment test guidelines post-implementation. Option B. Proceed with the automation, assuming that internal efficiency improvements inherently align with the spirit of the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test, and address any potential issues if they arise. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the proposed automated screening tool against all relevant guidelines and requirements of the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test before implementation, ensuring it maintains fairness, accuracy, and data integrity. Option D. Focus solely on the speed of candidate feedback, prioritizing the reduction of onboarding time above all other considerations, including detailed adherence to the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test's specific procedural requirements. Correct answer is A. Implement the automated screening tool immediately to address the identified delays, with a plan to review its compliance with Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test guidelines post-implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises due to the inherent tension between optimizing internal processes for efficiency and adhering to external regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. The need for deep analysis stems from the potential for even well-intentioned process improvements to inadvertently create compliance gaps or ethical breaches, if not carefully scrutinized against the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of proposed process changes against the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework, ensuring that any optimization does not compromise the fairness, transparency, or accuracy of the assessment process. This aligns with the ethical obligation to conduct business in a manner that upholds regulatory standards and maintains the trust of candidates and the assessment body. Specifically, it requires understanding and applying the principles of fair assessment, data privacy, and non-discrimination, as mandated by the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test's guidelines. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thorough regulatory review risks violating the spirit and letter of the assessment's governing rules. For instance, streamlining data handling without ensuring compliance with data protection clauses within the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment tests framework could lead to privacy breaches. Similarly, automating candidate feedback mechanisms without verifying that the automated outputs are objective, unbiased, and consistent with the assessment's stated evaluation criteria would be a failure. Another incorrect approach might involve modifying assessment content, scoring methodologies based solely on internal efficiency metrics, without validating that these changes maintain the assessment's validity and reliability, as per the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test's specific regulatory obligation. This framework should include a proactive risk assessment for any proposed process change, identifying potential compliance and ethical pitfalls. It necessitates a collaborative approach, involving compliance officers or legal counsel where appropriate, to ensure all optimizations are vetted against the established guidelines before implementation. The ultimate goal is to achieve efficiency gains without compromising the integrity and compliance of the hiring assessment process. Question 9. Upon reviewing the current operational workflows for the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment test, a team has identified several areas where efficiency could be enhanced. Which of the following strategies represents the most professionally sound and compliant method for optimizing these processes? Option A. Benchmark Ferguson Enterprises assessment processes against those of competitors and adopt their most advanced techniques without a thorough analysis of their applicability or potential impact on existing systems. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of existing assessment procedures, gathering quantitative data on time taken for each stage, error rates, and candidate feedback to pinpoint specific areas for improvement before proposing and implementing changes. Option C. Rely on informal discussions with experienced assessors to identify and implement changes based on their personal opinions and past experiences without formal data collection. Option D. Implement the latest industry standard assessment software immediately, assuming it will automatically streamline all current workflows and address any perceived inefficiencies. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of existing assessment procedures, gathering quantitative data on time taken for each stage, error rates, and candidate feedback to pinpoint specific areas for improvement before proposing and implementing changes. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Ferguson Enterprises is seeking to improve its internal processes, which directly impacts operational efficiency and potentially client service delivery. The challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant method for process optimization without introducing new risks or violating established guidelines. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both innovative and adheres strictly to the Ferguson Enterprises hiring assessment tests framework, which implicitly governs how such assessments and subsequent improvements are managed. The correct approach involves a systematic, data-driven review of existing workflows to identify bottlenecks and inefficiencies, followed by the implementation of targeted improvements based on this analysis. This method is professionally sound because it prioritizes evidence and measurable outcomes, aligning with principles of good governance and continuous improvement expected within a corporate assessment context. It ensures that changes are justified and likely to yield positive results, minimizing disruption and maximizing the effectiveness of the assessment process. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal feedback without rigorous data analysis risks making superficial changes that do not address root causes. This could lead to wasted resources and a failure to achieve genuine process optimization, potentially impacting the fairness and validity of the hiring assessment. Another incorrect approach, which involves adopting external best practices without considering Ferguson Enterprises' specific context and existing infrastructure, could introduce incompatible systems or processes, leading to operational failures and non-compliance with internal policies. Finally, an approach that focuses on technological solutions without a clear understanding of the underlying process issues is likely to be ineffective, as technology is a tool to support processes, not a solution in itself. This can lead to misallocation of resources and a failure to achieve the desired optimization. Professionals should approach process optimization by first establishing clear objectives, then gathering and analyzing relevant data to understand current performance. This should be followed by brainstorming potential solutions, evaluating them against feasibility, impact, and compliance criteria, and finally, implementing and monitoring the chosen improvements. This structured decision-making process ensures that actions are strategic, evidence-based, and aligned with organizational goals and regulatory expectations. Question 10. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual transaction activity within a specific department at Ferguson Enterprises, deviating from established norms. This deviation, while not immediately indicative of a clear violation, warrants careful consideration regarding potential regulatory implications. Option A. Assume the deviation is a temporary operational anomaly and monitor the situation for a longer period before taking any action. Option B. Report the anomaly to senior management as a potential issue without conducting any preliminary analysis of the data against regulatory requirements. Option C. Immediately halt all operations within the affected department pending a full regulatory audit. Option D. Initiate an immediate internal investigation, gathering all relevant transaction records and cross-referencing them with Ferguson Enterprises compliance policies and applicable regulatory guidelines to determine if a breach has occurred. Correct answer is D. Initiate an immediate internal investigation, gathering all relevant transaction records and cross-referencing them with Ferguson Enterprises compliance policies and applicable regulatory guidelines to determine if a breach has occurred. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Ferguson Enterprises to interpret complex monitoring data and determine the appropriate regulatory response. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between minor deviations that might be attributable to operational fluctuations and potential breaches of regulatory requirements that necessitate immediate action. A failure to act appropriately could lead to significant compliance issues, reputational damage, and financial penalties for Ferguson Enterprises. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for proactive compliance with the risk of overreacting to insignificant events. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based assessment of the monitoring data against established regulatory thresholds and internal policies. This approach prioritizes understanding the context and potential implications of the observed deviations before escalating. Specifically, it requires consulting relevant Ferguson Enterprises policies and the applicable regulatory framework to ascertain if the observed activity constitutes a breach. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and responsible compliance, ensuring that actions taken are proportionate and justified by regulatory obligations. An incorrect approach that immediately escalates without proper analysis risks creating unnecessary alarm and diverting resources. This could be seen as a failure to exercise professional judgment, potentially violating internal procedures for handling such alerts and misinterpreting the intent of regulatory oversight. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the data due to its perceived minor nature, represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a disregard for compliance obligations and a lack of commitment to maintaining the integrity of Ferguson Enterprises operations. Such inaction could lead to undetected breaches, resulting in severe consequences if discovered by regulators. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with such monitoring alerts. This process should begin with a clear understanding of the monitoring system's purpose and the specific regulatory requirements it is designed to track. Next, they should gather all relevant data and contextual information. This is followed by an objective analysis of the data against established benchmarks and policies. If a potential breach is identified, the next step is to consult with relevant internal stakeholders or legal counsel, as appropriate, before taking any definitive action. This methodical approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both regulatory mandates and ethical standards. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a Ferguson Enterprises employee has recently been privy to confidential, material non-public information regarding an upcoming significant product launch that is expected to positively impact the company's stock price. The employee is considering selling some of their personal investments in other companies to free up capital to purchase more Ferguson Enterprises stock before the public announcement. What is the most appropriate course of action for the employee? Option A. Sell personal investments in unrelated companies to fund the purchase of Ferguson Enterprises stock, as this does not directly involve trading on the specific information. Option B. Refrain from trading Ferguson Enterprises stock and consult with Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department regarding the company's policy on trading during periods of material non-public information. Option C. Immediately purchase Ferguson Enterprises stock, as the information is positive and will benefit the company. Option D. Discuss the potential trade with a trusted colleague at Ferguson Enterprises to get their opinion on the timing. Correct answer is C. Immediately purchase Ferguson Enterprises stock, as the information is positive and will benefit the company. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee to balance their personal financial interests with their fiduciary duties to Ferguson Enterprises. The core conflict lies in potential insider trading, which is a serious regulatory and ethical violation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that no confidential, material non-public information is used for personal gain, thereby protecting the company's reputation and market integrity. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies regarding trading in company stock and the use of material non-public information. This means refraining from trading until the information becomes public or seeking explicit clearance from the compliance department. This approach is correct because it directly upholds regulatory requirements against insider trading and aligns with ethical principles of loyalty and good faith owed to the employer. It prioritizes the integrity of the market and the company's compliance obligations over personal financial opportunity. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the trade immediately, assuming the information is not truly material or that the personal benefit outweighs the risk. This is a regulatory failure because it disregards the definition of material non-public information and the prohibition against trading on it. It also represents an ethical failure by prioritizing personal gain over the company's interests and potentially engaging in market manipulation. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the potential trade with a colleague at Ferguson Enterprises to gauge their opinion on the materiality of the information. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it risks further dissemination of material non-public information, potentially creating more individuals who could be implicated in insider trading. It also violates the principle of confidentiality. A third incorrect approach would be to trade in a different, unrelated company's stock based on the assumption that this avoids any conflict. While it might seem like a way to circumvent the immediate issue, it demonstrates a misunderstanding of the broader ethical obligation to act in the best interest of Ferguson Enterprises and avoid situations that could create even the appearance of impropriety or conflict of interest, especially if the information obtained could indirectly influence decisions about other companies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest or regulatory breaches. This involves understanding company policies, relevant laws, and ethical codes. When faced with such a situation, the professional should err on the side of caution, seek clarification from the compliance department, and prioritize the integrity of the company and the market above personal gain. If there is any doubt, the action should not be taken until clarity is obtained. Question 12. Examination of the data shows that a senior trader at Ferguson Enterprises, with whom you have a cordial working relationship, appears to be consistently making trades for a specific client account immediately after receiving confidential, non-public information about a company from an external source. This information is not yet publicly available. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for you to take? Option A. Directly approach the senior trader to inquire about their trading patterns and the source of their information. Option B. Discuss your concerns with a trusted colleague in another department to get their opinion. Option C. Ignore the observation, as it is not your direct responsibility to monitor the trading activities of senior personnel. Option D. Immediately report your observations to the Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department. Correct answer is D. Immediately report your observations to the Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a candidate at Ferguson Enterprises due to the potential conflict between client interests and the firm's internal policies, specifically concerning the handling of material non-public information. The requirement to maintain confidentiality and act in the best interest of clients, while also adhering to internal compliance procedures, necessitates careful judgment. A deep understanding of regulatory obligations and ethical principles is paramount to avoid breaches that could lead to reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and loss of client trust. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the situation to the compliance department. This is the most professionally sound and ethically defensible action because it ensures that the handling of potentially sensitive information is managed by those with the expertise and authority to assess the situation against relevant regulations and firm policies. Specifically, this aligns with the principles of client protection and market integrity, which are foundational to financial services regulation. By reporting the observation, the candidate upholds their duty to act with integrity and to prevent potential misuse of information, thereby safeguarding both the client and Ferguson Enterprises. This proactive step demonstrates a commitment to compliance and ethical conduct, which are critical for maintaining the firm's reputation and regulatory standing. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the observation, assuming it is insignificant or not the candidate's responsibility to address. This failure is significant because it neglects the duty to act with due diligence and to prevent potential harm. By not reporting, the candidate risks facilitating a breach of regulations designed to ensure fair markets and protect investors, which could lead to severe penalties for Ferguson Enterprises and the individuals involved. Another incorrect approach would be to directly confront the senior trader without involving compliance. While seemingly proactive, this bypasses the established internal control mechanisms. This is ethically problematic as it could lead to an uncontrolled disclosure of concerns, potentially creating further complications or alerting individuals to an investigation prematurely. It also fails to leverage the expertise of the compliance department, which is specifically tasked with navigating such sensitive situations in accordance with regulatory frameworks. A further incorrect approach would be to discuss the observation with colleagues outside of the compliance department. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and could lead to the unauthorized dissemination of potentially material non-public information, exacerbating the risk of regulatory violation and reputational damage. It undermines the integrity of the firm's internal controls and demonstrates a lack of understanding of the importance of strict information handling protocols. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's compliance policies and relevant regulatory obligations. When faced with a potential issue, the immediate step should be to identify the appropriate internal channel for reporting, which is typically the compliance department. This ensures that the matter is handled systematically, documented, and investigated by trained professionals who can assess the risks and take necessary actions in accordance with legal and ethical standards. Question 13. Assessment of how a Ferguson Enterprises junior analyst should respond upon overhearing a confidential conversation between two senior executives discussing an upcoming, unannounced merger that could significantly impact the stock price of a publicly traded company. Option A. Proceed with purchasing shares of the target company's stock, believing the information is valuable and could lead to a profitable trade. Option B. Immediately cease any further engagement with the information. Refrain from trading or discussing it with anyone outside of official reporting channels, and report the overheard conversation to Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department. Option C. Ignore the overheard conversation, assuming it is not material or that it is not their responsibility to act on such information. Option D. Discuss the overheard information with a trusted friend who works in a different firm, suggesting they might find it useful for their investment strategy. The correct answer is B. Immediately cease any further engagement with the information. Refrain from trading or discussing it with anyone outside of official reporting channels, and report the overheard conversation to Ferguson Enterprises Compliance Department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Ferguson Enterprises employee regarding the appropriate handling of potentially material non-public information. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to act on information that could impact investment decisions with the legal and ethical obligations to prevent insider trading. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate research and the misuse of privileged information. The correct approach involves immediately ceasing any further discussion or action related to the information and reporting it through the designated internal channels at Ferguson Enterprises. This aligns with best professional practice by prioritizing compliance with securities regulations and internal policies designed to prevent insider trading. Specifically, this approach upholds the principle of fair markets by ensuring that all investors have access to the same material information. It also demonstrates adherence to the duty of loyalty and care owed to Ferguson Enterprises and its clients by safeguarding against reputational damage and legal penalties associated with insider trading violations. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with trading based on the overheard conversation. This is a direct violation of insider trading laws, which prohibit trading securities on the basis of material non-public information. Such an action would expose the individual and Ferguson Enterprises to severe legal consequences, including fines and imprisonment, and would fundamentally undermine market integrity. Another incorrect approach would be to share the information with a colleague who is not involved in the decision-making process or who might be tempted to trade on it. This constitutes tipping, which is also illegal and unethical. It facilitates insider trading by disseminating material non-public information to others, thereby creating an unfair advantage. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the information and take no action. While this avoids direct participation in insider trading, it fails to address the potential breach of confidentiality and the risk that the information might be acted upon by others. Best practice dictates proactive reporting to ensure proper internal controls are exercised. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves a clear understanding of what constitutes material non-public information, a commitment to adhering to company policies and securities laws, and a willingness to err on the side of caution by reporting suspicious information through appropriate channels. When in doubt, seeking guidance from compliance departments or legal counsel is paramount. Question 14. Which approach would be most effective for Ferguson Enterprises in conducting a comprehensive risk assessment that aligns with regulatory expectations and ensures robust operational oversight? Option A. Implementing a risk assessment methodology that systematically identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes potential risks across all business units, considering both internal and external factors, and aligning with the company's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Option B. Relying on informal discussions with department heads to gather information on potential risks, prioritizing those that are most frequently mentioned. Option C. Focusing the risk assessment exclusively on risks that have led to significant financial losses for competitors in the past year, assuming these are the most critical threats. Option D. Conducting a risk assessment only when a specific regulatory change is announced, to address the immediate compliance requirements. The correct answer is A. Implementing a risk assessment methodology that systematically identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes potential risks across all business units, considering both internal and external factors, and aligning with the company's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises by requiring a nuanced understanding of risk assessment in the context of potential regulatory scrutiny. The challenge lies in balancing proactive risk identification with the need for efficient and effective resource allocation, all while adhering to the specific regulatory framework governing Ferguson Enterprises' operations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen approach not only identifies potential risks, but also prioritizes them based on their likelihood and impact, aligning with the company's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential risks, considering both internal and external factors that could affect Ferguson Enterprises. This approach is professionally sound because it aligns with the principles of robust risk management, which are often mandated or strongly encouraged by regulatory bodies. By adopting a structured methodology, Ferguson Enterprises can ensure that all significant risks are identified, assessed, and appropriately mitigated, thereby demonstrating due diligence and compliance. This proactive stance helps prevent potential financial losses, reputational damage, and regulatory sanctions. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate, high-profile risks would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of comprehensive risk identification, potentially overlooking less obvious but equally damaging threats. Such an approach could lead to regulatory noncompliance if the overlooked risks fall within areas of specific regulatory concern. Another incorrect approach, which relies on anecdotal evidence or past incidents without a structured framework, is also professionally deficient. This method is subjective and prone to bias, failing to provide a systematic and defensible basis for risk assessment. It may lead to misallocation of resources and an incomplete understanding of the overall risk landscape, potentially exposing Ferguson Enterprises to unforeseen regulatory issues. Professionals at Ferguson Enterprises should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements applicable to their industry and operations. This should be followed by a structured risk identification process, encompassing all business functions and external influences. Subsequently, a qualitative and quantitative assessment of identified risks should be performed, considering their probability and potential impact. Finally, a risk mitigation and monitoring plan should be developed and implemented, with regular reviews to ensure its continued effectiveness and alignment with evolving regulatory expectations. Question 15. Implementation of a robust compliance framework at Ferguson Enterprises requires careful consideration of how to handle client transactions that appear unusual. If a Ferguson Enterprises relationship manager observes a pattern of transactions for a particular client that deviates significantly from their established profile and seems inconsistent with their stated business activities, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure regulatory compliance and uphold ethical standards? Option A. Ignore the unusual transaction patterns to avoid potential client dissatisfaction and maintain the business relationship. Option B. Contact the client directly to inquire about the nature and purpose of the unusual transactions before taking any further action. Option C. Conduct an internal review of the client's transaction history and supporting documentation to determine if there are reasonable grounds to suspect illicit activity, consulting Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines before any external reporting. Option D. Immediately file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with the relevant regulatory authority based on the initial observation of unusual transaction patterns. The correct answer is C. Conduct an internal review of the client's transaction history and supporting documentation to determine if there are reasonable grounds to suspect illicit activity, consulting Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines before any external reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Ferguson Enterprises due to the inherent tension between client confidentiality and the need to comply with regulatory reporting obligations. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the relevant regulatory framework governing financial services and data privacy. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the duty to protect client information with the legal mandate to report suspicious activities. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the client's transaction history and documentation against Ferguson Enterprises' internal policies and the specific reporting thresholds and triggers defined by the relevant regulatory body. This approach prioritizes adherence to the law and ethical conduct by ensuring that any reporting is based on a thorough, objective assessment of facts and potential regulatory breaches, rather than on assumptions or incomplete information. This aligns with the principle of acting with integrity and due diligence, as mandated by regulatory frameworks that require firms to establish robust anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) programs. Specifically, it upholds the regulatory requirement to report suspicious transactions when there are reasonable grounds to suspect that funds are linked to criminal activity, while simultaneously respecting client privacy by not over-reporting or reporting without sufficient justification. An incorrect approach would be to immediately file a suspicious activity report, SAR, based solely on the client's unusual transaction patterns, without conducting an internal investigation. This fails to uphold the principle of due diligence and could lead to unnecessary reporting, potentially damaging client relationships and wasting regulatory resources. It also risks violating data privacy principles if the reporting is not justified by concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the transaction patterns due to a desire to avoid client scrutiny or potential disruption to business relationships. This directly contravenes the regulatory obligation to monitor transactions and report suspicious activity, exposing Ferguson Enterprises to significant legal and reputational risks, including fines and sanctions for non-compliance. A third incorrect approach would be to seek advice from the client directly about the nature of the transactions before reporting. This is a critical breach of confidentiality and could tip off the client to an ongoing investigation, hindering any potential regulatory action and constituting a serious ethical and legal violation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, risk-based approach. First, identify the potential regulatory or ethical issue. Second, consult the relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, gather all necessary factual information and conduct a thorough, objective review. Fourth, assess the information against the established criteria for reporting or other required actions. Fifth, document all steps taken and the rationale behind the decision. Finally, seek guidance from compliance or legal departments when in doubt. Question 16. Operational review demonstrates that a senior analyst at Ferguson Enterprises has a close personal relationship with a key decision-maker at a prospective client company. This prospective client is currently being considered for a significant new service contract with Ferguson Enterprises. The senior analyst has not disclosed this relationship and is actively involved in the evaluation process for the new contract. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical obligations for Ferguson Enterprises? Option A. The senior analyst immediately discloses their personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the compliance department, and recuses themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation and decision-making process for the prospective client's contract until a conflict of interest assessment is completed. Option B. The senior analyst informs their supervisor of the relationship, but continues to participate in the evaluation, believing they can manage the situation discreetly without formal disclosure to the compliance department. Option C. The senior analyst privately discusses the situation with the decision maker at the prospective client company to gauge their comfort level before deciding whether to disclose the relationship internally. Option D. The senior analyst continues their involvement in the evaluation process, confident that their professional judgment will not be compromised by the personal relationship, and assumes the relationship is not significant enough to warrant disclosure. The correct answer is A. The senior analyst immediately discloses their personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the compliance department, and recuses themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation and decision-making process for the prospective client's contract until a conflict of interest assessment is completed. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because Ferguson Enterprises is facing a situation where a potential conflict of interest could arise, impacting the integrity of their business operations and client relationships. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the company's need for efficient operations and potential new business opportunities with the stringent ethical and regulatory obligations to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain client confidentiality. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not influenced by personal gain or undue pressure, and that all actions align with the established regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent process of identifying, assessing, and managing the potential conflict of interest. This means immediately disclosing the relationship to the relevant internal stakeholders at Ferguson Enterprises and seeking guidance on how to proceed. The regulatory and ethical justification for this approach stems from the fundamental principles of fiduciary duty, client protection, and maintaining market integrity. Regulations typically require financial professionals and firms to act in the best interests of their clients and to avoid situations where personal interests could compromise professional judgment. Transparency and seeking internal review are crucial to demonstrating adherence to these principles and to ensuring that any potential conflict is managed in a way that mitigates risk to Ferguson Enterprises and its clients. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the new business opportunity without disclosing the relationship. This failure would violate regulatory requirements that mandate disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for the trust placed in Ferguson Enterprises by its clients. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the relationship as insignificant without proper assessment. This oversight could lead to a genuine conflict of interest going unaddressed, potentially resulting in regulatory sanction, reputational damage, and harm to clients. A further incorrect approach would be to make a unilateral decision to proceed based on a personal assessment of risk, without consulting internal compliance or legal departments. This bypasses established governance procedures designed to safeguard against conflicts and ensure regulatory compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. This framework typically involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest, 2. Assessing the nature and severity of the conflict, 3. Disclosing the conflict to appropriate parties, 4. Seeking guidance and approval for managing the conflict, 5. Implementing agreed-upon mitigation strategies, 6. Documenting the entire process. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-reasoned, compliant, and protect the interests of all stakeholders. Question 17. During the evaluation of a networking event, a representative from Ferguson Enterprises engages in a conversation with an executive from a key client company. The executive begins to share insights into their company's internal challenges and future strategic directions. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Ferguson Enterprises representative? Option A. Offer specific, unsolicited advice and recommendations based on the executive's disclosures, aiming to build a stronger, more collaborative relationship. Option B. Actively listen and take detailed notes on the executive's insights into internal challenges and future strategic directions, as this information could be valuable for Ferguson Enterprises business development. Option C. Gently probe for more detailed, non-public information about the client's upcoming projects and competitive landscape to better understand their needs and potential opportunities for Ferguson Enterprises. Option D. Politely acknowledge the executive's insights, steer the conversation towards general industry trends and publicly available market analysis, and avoid discussing specific client strategies or non-public information. The correct answer is D. Politely acknowledge the executive's insights, steer the conversation towards general industry trends and publicly available market analysis, and avoid discussing specific client strategies or non-public information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Ferguson Enterprises to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with regulatory expectations regarding client interactions and information handling. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the desire to build rapport and gather insights with the imperative to maintain professional boundaries and avoid any perception of impropriety or undue influence. Careful judgment is required to discern when a conversation crosses the line from professional networking to potentially compromising information exchange or relationship building that could influence future business decisions inappropriately. The correct approach involves maintaining a professional demeanor, focusing discussions on industry trends and general market insights rather than specific client-related information or future business opportunities that could be influenced by the relationship. This approach aligns with best practices in client relations and regulatory compliance by prioritizing transparency, fairness, and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. Specifically, it adheres to principles of ethical conduct that prohibit the use of privileged information or the creation of situations that could lead to preferential treatment or insider dealing. By keeping the conversation general and focused on publicly available or broadly understood industry dynamics, the individual at Ferguson Enterprises upholds their professional integrity and the company's reputation. An incorrect approach that involves actively probing for non-public information about a competitor's upcoming product launch or seeking to understand the specific rationale behind a client's recent strategic decisions would be professionally unacceptable. This would represent a failure to uphold ethical standards by attempting to gain an unfair advantage through information gathering that is not publicly accessible or appropriate for a professional networking context. Such actions could also violate regulatory guidelines concerning insider information and fair competition, potentially leading to investigations and sanctions against both the individual and Ferguson Enterprises. Another incorrect approach, such as offering unsolicited advice or insights that are highly specific to the client's business operations or future plans, also constitutes a failure. While seemingly helpful, this can create an implicit obligation or expectation, blurring the lines of professional advice and potentially leading to a perception of undue influence or a conflict of interest if Ferguson Enterprises later seeks to do business with that client or their competitors. This approach risks creating a situation where the client feels indebted or that their business is being steered based on a personal relationship rather than objective merit. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the company's code of conduct and relevant regulatory frameworks. Professionals should always ask themselves, could this conversation or action be perceived as creating a conflict of interest, providing an unfair advantage, or compromising my professional integrity? If the answer is even potentially yes, it is prudent to steer the conversation back to general industry topics, maintain professional distance, and avoid any exchange of non-public or sensitive information. Prioritizing ethical conduct and regulatory compliance over short-term relationship building is paramount. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that a key client of Ferguson Enterprises, who is aware of an upcoming significant product launch, is pressing a Ferguson Enterprises analyst for details about the launch's projected market impact before the official public announcement. The client states they need this information to make informed investment decisions and assures the analyst that the information will be kept confidential. The analyst knows the details would be considered material non-public information. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Ferguson Enterprises analyst? Option A. Politely decline to provide any specific details about the product launch, explaining that the information is not yet publicly available and that Ferguson Enterprises adheres strictly to regulations regarding the disclosure of material non-public information. Option B. Advise the client to consult Ferguson Enterprises' Public Relations Department for any official statements regarding upcoming product launches. Option C. Inform the client that, while specific details cannot be shared, there are positive developments expected from the product launch that should be beneficial. Option D. Provide the client with the projected market impact figures, emphasizing the importance of confidentiality and the client's assurance that the information will not be used for trading purposes. The correct answer is A. Politely decline to provide any specific details about the product launch, explaining that the information is not yet publicly available and that Ferguson Enterprises adheres strictly to regulations regarding the disclosure of material non-public information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a candidate at Ferguson Enterprises due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the firm's internal policies regarding the disclosure of material non-public information. Navigating this situation requires a deep understanding of regulatory obligations and ethical principles to ensure compliance and maintain client trust. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the client's desire for timely information with the legal and ethical imperative to prevent insider trading. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct by refusing to disclose the material non-public information until it has been officially disseminated to the public. This aligns with the principles of fair markets and investor protection, which are fundamental to financial regulations. Specifically, this approach upholds the prohibition against trading on or tipping others about material non-public information, as mandated by securities laws and professional conduct guidelines. By adhering to this, the candidate demonstrates integrity and a commitment to upholding the reputation and legal standing of Ferguson Enterprises. An incorrect approach would be to disclose the information to the client, even with the client's assurance of discretion. This action would constitute a breach of regulatory rules prohibiting the dissemination of material non-public information, potentially leading to insider trading violations for both the firm and the client. It also violates ethical duties of confidentiality and fair dealing. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's request and provide no response. While this avoids direct disclosure, it fails to professionally manage the client relationship and could be perceived as unhelpful or dismissive, potentially damaging the firm's reputation and client satisfaction without adequately addressing the underlying regulatory concern. A third incorrect approach might be to vaguely allude to upcoming positive developments without revealing specifics. This is still problematic as it can create unfounded expectations and may be interpreted as a subtle tip-off, blurring the lines of what constitutes material non-public information and its disclosure. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature of the information. Is it material and non-public? If it is, the next step is to consult internal policies and relevant regulations regarding its disclosure. The paramount consideration must always be regulatory compliance and ethical integrity. If there is any doubt, seeking guidance from a supervisor or compliance department is crucial. The professional decision-making process should prioritize transparency with regulators and clients within the bounds of the law, ensuring that all actions are defensible and uphold the highest standards of conduct. Question 19. Performance analysis shows a significant divergence between projected revenue targets and actual sales figures for Ferguson Enterprises' new product line. Management is concerned that this discrepancy, if not properly addressed and communicated, could lead to a material misstatement in the upcoming quarterly financial reports. What is the most appropriate course of action for Ferguson Enterprises to take from a stakeholder perspective, considering regulatory compliance and ethical obligations? Option A. Initiate an immediate, independent forensic audit to thoroughly investigate the performance data, identify the causes of the discrepancy, and determine the impact on financial reporting, followed by transparent disclosure to stakeholders as required by regulations. Option B. Instruct the sales and marketing departments to aggressively push the product to meet targets in the short term, with the understanding that any reporting discrepancies will be addressed in future periods once sales stabilize. Option C. Issue a press release highlighting the innovative nature of the new product line and downplaying the current sales figures as a temporary market adjustment, while internally exploring minor accounting adjustments to align reported numbers with targets. Option D. Publicly acknowledge the performance shortfall without a detailed investigation, stating that the company is reviewing its forecasting models and will provide an update in the next fiscal year. Correct answer is A. Initiate an immediate, independent forensic audit to thoroughly investigate the performance data, identify the causes of the discrepancy, and determine the impact on financial reporting, followed by transparent disclosure to stakeholders as required by regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Ferguson Enterprises, as a publicly traded entity, has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders. The performance analysis indicates a potential discrepancy between reported results and actual operational outcomes, raising concerns about the integrity of financial reporting. Navigating this situation requires a delicate balance between transparency, regulatory compliance, and maintaining investor confidence. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing the situation and responding in a manner that upholds ethical standards and legal obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough, independent investigation into the performance data and its implications for financial reporting. This means engaging internal audit or external forensic accountants to scrutinize the figures, identify any misstatements or irregularities, and determine the root cause. This approach is ethically sound and legally mandated under the regulatory framework governing public companies, which emphasizes accurate and timely financial disclosure. It aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the duty to act in the best interests of shareholders by ensuring the reliability of information upon which investment decisions are made. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the performance analysis without further inquiry, perhaps due to pressure to maintain positive market perception. This would constitute a failure to exercise due diligence and could lead to material misstatements in financial reports, violating securities laws and regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to manage the narrative or selectively disclose information to downplay any negative findings. This constitutes a breach of transparency and could be construed as market manipulation or fraud, severely damaging Ferguson Enterprises' reputation and incurring significant legal penalties. A third incorrect approach might be to immediately implement drastic, unverified corrective actions based on incomplete information, which could be disruptive, costly, and potentially exacerbate the problem without addressing the underlying issues. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This begins with acknowledging the potential issue and gathering all relevant information. Next, they should consult the applicable regulatory framework and internal policies to understand their obligations. Seeking advice from legal counsel and compliance officers is crucial. The decision-making process should prioritize accuracy, integrity, and compliance, ensuring that all actions are defensible and in the long-term interest of the company and its stakeholders. Question 20. System analysis indicates that a long-standing client of Ferguson Enterprises, who is also a significant shareholder in a publicly traded company, has requested access to Ferguson Enterprises' internal research reports on that specific company before they are publicly released. The client states they will use this information solely for their personal investment decisions and will not disclose it to anyone else. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Ferguson Enterprises employee handling this request? Option A. Politely decline the request, citing Ferguson Enterprises' strict adherence to regulations regarding the disclosure of non-public information and offering to provide the reports once they are publicly available. Option B. Provide the client with the requested research reports, assuring them that their discretion is trusted and that this is a valuable client relationship. Option C. Inform the client that while direct sharing is not possible, Ferguson Enterprises can offer a consultation to discuss the general market trends related to the company without revealing specific report details. Option D. Attempt to find a way to subtly share the key findings of the research reports with the client without directly handing over the documents to maintain a good client relationship. The correct answer is A. Politely decline the request, citing Ferguson Enterprises' strict adherence to regulations regarding the disclosure of non-public information and offering to provide the reports once they are publicly available. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Ferguson Enterprises employee due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in navigating the delicate balance between client satisfaction and adherence to legal obligations, particularly concerning the disclosure of non-public information. Misjudging this situation could lead to severe regulatory penalties for Ferguson Enterprises and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request and explaining that Ferguson Enterprises is bound by specific regulations that prohibit the sharing of such information. This upholds the company's commitment to regulatory compliance, which is paramount in the financial services industry. Specifically, this aligns with the principles of client confidentiality and data protection as mandated by relevant financial regulations. Assuming a U.S. jurisdiction for this exam, this would typically involve SEC and FINRA rules regarding non-public information and insider trading prevention. By adhering to these regulations, Ferguson Enterprises demonstrates its integrity and trustworthiness. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that involves providing the requested information, even with the client's assurance of discretion, is incorrect because it directly violates regulations prohibiting the disclosure of material non-public information. This could lead to accusations of insider trading or market manipulation, resulting in significant fines and legal repercussions for both the individual and Ferguson Enterprises. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's request without a clear response. This inaction can be interpreted as tacit approval or an attempt to circumvent the rules, potentially leading to the client pursuing the information through other, less scrupulous means, or escalating the issue. It fails to proactively address the regulatory concern. Finally, an approach that involves attempting to interpret the regulations to find a loophole to satisfy the client is also incorrect. Regulatory frameworks are designed to be clear, and attempts to creatively circumvent them are unethical and legally risky. Such actions undermine the integrity of the regulatory system and expose Ferguson Enterprises to significant risk. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Ferguson Enterprises should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance above all else. When faced with a client request that appears to conflict with regulations, the first step is to clearly identify the specific regulation that might be implicated. Next, consult internal compliance policies and, if necessary, seek guidance from the compliance department. The professional should then communicate clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the limitations imposed by regulations without being dismissive. The focus should always be on maintaining ethical standards and protecting the firm and its clients from regulatory breaches.